American Studies at Winthrop University. I am also your host for tonight's program. We are kicking off Black History Month with a special focus on the freedom movement in South Carolina. The subject of our talk is Stories of Struggle, the Clash over Civil Rights in South Carolina. This moment marks the 60th anniversary of the Jail No Bail protest in Rock Hill. It's also the 61st anniversary of the wave of the student protest movement that began in Greensboro in 1960 with the students from North Carolina A&T State University. We are also in the midst of a new movement for justice following the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Thus, it is fitting that we have this conversation tonight. As we begin, I want to thank everyone responsible for making this program happen. The University of South Carolina Press, the York County Library, the Rock Hill Community Relations Council, the Freedom Walkway Committee, Historic Rock Hill, the family of the mighty Reverend Cecil A. Ivory, WRHI, York County's home for news, talk, and sports, CN2, your hometown news, and I am also grateful to Terry Plum for the invitation to participate, and it is my honor to introduce the stars of this evening's program. First, a journalist with more than 3 decades of experience as a senior writer, associate editor, and columnist, Claudia Smith Brinson has won more than 30 awards for her work, including Knight Ritter's Award for Excellence, twice, and an O. Henry Award for short fiction. She was a member of the Pulitzer finalist team covering Hurricane Hugo in 1989. In addition, Smith Brinson taught courses at both the University of South Carolina and Columbia College. She is the author of Stories of Struggle. And I am also pleased to welcome Dr. Thomas W. Gaither, who was raised in Great Falls, South Carolina. He worked as a field secretary for the Congress of Racial Equality. During those years, he was involved in both the student sit-in movement and with the Freedom Riders. Moreover, he was the only member of the Friendship Nine who was not a student of Friendship College, though he does have a connection to the institution with his parents having met there back in the day. Dr. Gaither earned a BS from Claflin University, an MS from Atlanta University, and a doctoral degree from the University of Iowa. He taught biology at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania for 30 years until his retirement in 2007. To ensure that his legacy lives on through students, SRU established the Dr. Thomas Gaither Award for Excellence in Leadership. And it's with that, I'd like to welcome all of you this evening. And I'd like to get right into our questions. And my first question is directed toward Claudia. When the general public thinks of the civil rights movement, states like North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi come to mind. Why not South Carolina?
South Carolina is a small state, and I have a couple of theories about this. One would be that the Greensboro sit-ins immediately turned attention to Greensboro. February 1st, these were not the very first sit-ins that ever happened. CORE and the NAACP had sit-ins in the 40s and 50s, but the Greensboro sit-in was the one that caught fire. Second, when you think about what we know about the civil rights movement, we know more about later years. For example, the Edmund Pettus Bridge is a few years later. We know it now best through Senator John Lewis, who was one of the leaders. But people knew it then because it was the first time that TV cameras were at a beating. And it was the cameras filmed the event. They filmed the charge by the police and the horrible beatings of people like Senator Lewis. And then the film was flown to, for example, ABC interrupted a broadcast to show it around 9 p.m. So television cameras played a role, and that's later than when the sit-ins are happening in 1960. Another thing I believe is that South Carolina was, I hate to use the word effective, we'll have to see what Dr. Gaither thinks about this, in its very strong propaganda of itself as a moderate state. And because there were no in-state Black-owned newspapers, not after 1955, and white-owned newspapers often just stopped covering the sit-in movement, it would be difficult for anyone who was not in the town where the sit-ins were happening to know that they were happening. So suppression is another answer. What do you think, Dr. Gaither?
Well, I think geography is also a factor. I think that we start to think about the South and we think about the Deep South as perhaps starting in Georgia, then progressing to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So I think that is also a factor. The way we tend to think about things and compartmentalize them in our minds and what has happened in those places that we are compartmentalizing.
I have a little tidbit on that. So the very first sit-ins in South Carolina were in Rock Hill on February 12th, and the national headlines were sort of a hand-wringing. Sit-ins have entered the bastion of the Confederacy. They have crossed the border into South Carolina. There were exclamation points about the sit-ins beginning in South Carolina. And I suppose this is a hint that there was an idea in the right press that it wasn't going to spread. And so in that way, the entrance into South Carolina was dramatic, but I do think you're right in terms of what we think of as the Deep South, that perhaps we're thinking of other larger states.
What knowledge do you think South Carolinians themselves have of the things that have happened here, given that there was an absence of coverage nationwide that would bring attention to the state? How well did people here understand what was happening?
You know, white privilege is very effective. Many people, I did not grow up in South Carolina. I have family attached to South Carolina, but did not grow up here. But white readers, and the book's been out since November 23rd, so I don't have a large sampling here, but white readers are upset because if they grew up here, they say, I didn't know this was happening. And the other part of this is because of the suppression, there is really a very strong shock value to the book because there are horrible things that happen to people, and these stories are not well known. So none of these stories would be a surprise to Black readers, but they are a great surprise to white readers. I should add here that when I first started interviewing Black elders, everybody I talked to knew someone who had been lynched. And I need to remind listeners that a lynching is an extrajudicial murder. It doesn't have to have a mob and someone hanging at a tree. It can be 2 or 3 people knocking on your door and shooting you. That's still a lynching.
One of my coworkers here on the Winthrop faculty, who's now retired, she had an uncle who was lynched in South Carolina many years ago. So you don't have to go that far to run into that history. You mentioned having come to South Carolina and having connections to the state, but not growing up here. Dr. Gaither, you did grow up here. So can you tell us what it was like growing up in Great Falls during the Jim Crow era in a family that clearly valued education? I mentioned earlier that your parents met at Friendship, and they certainly seem to bestow a love and appreciation of education within you. What was it like growing up here in the Jim Crow era and attending Jim Crow schools?
It was very, very difficult, especially difficult because I valued education all of my life. And I was engineered through the schools of South Carolina to make sure that I would not be successful in life. And I very often reflect back on that, and it's almost a source of anger. I have to draw from my viewpoint in nonviolence to say, well, we'll just have to take what we had and try to make the very best of it.
Dr. Gaither's school was, for his first 7 years, his teacher was his mother. It was a one-room school, right, Dr. Gaither? You
It
had
was
to
a
haul in
one-room
water.
school with a pot belly, I'm not sure, 350-gallon drum or something as the heater. And if you sat close to it, of course, you'd burn up. But almost invariably every day it would get to the point where we thought it was adjusted. And then all of a sudden it would start sort of puffing and then fill the entire room with smoke. We did not have running water. We used privies as toilets, of course. And yeah, it was austere. It was very, very difficult. We did not have a library. Our library consisted of books that had been discarded by the white schools, often with all the pages torn out of them, or many of the pages torn out of them. Our resource for water was a man across the road from the school who permitted a couple of the more responsible older students to bring water back. And we had mason jars and mayonnaise jars on which we pasted adhesive tape, and we put the name of the student on that tape. So when you got ready to have water, or wanted water, you'd have to raise your hand, the teacher would give you permission, and you'd go back and get a drink of water. It was very difficult.
And Dr. Gaither's father was fired because he had the bravery to notice and mention that his paycheck did not match what he was actually supposed to be paid, right?
That is correct.
You might wonder, how is this possible? How could schools be so underfunded in years when white children were going to schools that were brick with running water, with heat, with playgrounds, with libraries? And the short answer is white school boards felt the taxes needed to go to white people. And so many Black schools were provided by the parents or the churches. The churches might have an extra building, a family might donate an abandoned building, there might be a hunting lodge that would be used. There were Rosenwald schools. This was the Sears and Roebuck philanthropists who came in and built schools, but tax money, while Black citizens were paying taxes, was not going to support Black schools. In the 40s, it was 10 to 1, $10 million to white schools to 1 million for all the Black schools.
I think that's very important to note because oftentimes when folks talk about the Jim Crow era, they focus on things like water for chocolate, separate water fountains and entrances, and things that were designed to belittle and demean people so that they would not fight back against Jim Crow. Yet there were politics and economics at play. People were disenfranchised, and they were also cut out from enjoying the benefits provided by local and state governments as taxpayers and citizens. You talk in the book about the sort of reprisals that were visited upon Black South Carolinians for speaking out. You talk about what happened to Dr. Gaither's father, who was run out of the teaching profession because of his activism, because of his association with union members. Dr. Gaither, can you talk about what else motivated you to get involved in the movement, having recognized what happened to your parents for their thoughts and their activism, and also sensing the deprivation that you experienced as a student coming up in the Great Falls schools?
Well, I think I just grew into being an activist or being in favor of activism because of the way my parents brought me up. I can remember going to hear Jim Hinton speak at the Columbia Township Auditorium when I must have been no more than 8 or 9 years old. And my dad would take my brother and I to hear Hinton. And what we would do, he would hold one of us high enough so that we could get some oxygen, put one down, pick the other child up and do the same thing. So we sort of grew into a posture of opposing the status quo and trying to make sure that we did what was necessary for us to escape what had obviously caught most of the people in the community all the way across the South, in fact. The school that I went to, by the way, was owned by an AME Zion church. And we did not have buses when I went to that school. In fact, I remember one day when the white kids had buses and we did not, and the roads were not always covered with asphalt. So there was one instance where we were going up a hill, walking on the grass, and the white kids were in their bus going up the hill, but it had a red mud surface. So they got about halfway up the hill and that bus was spinning, and we walked by, and I can remember saying, wow, at least we're moving, at least we're moving.
I should add here on your question, Dr. Belk, that Dr. Gaither went to Claflin University and he had the good fortune of meeting James T. McCain, right?
Yes.
And Mr. McCain was one of the founders of the Sumter NAACP. He had been fired twice by the state of South Carolina and roles as a principal because of his association with the NAACP. And he became the first Corps field secretary in the South. Corps was a biracial organization that had been founded in Chicago, and it was outgrowth of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was an anti-war conscientious objector organization. And so there was a natural growth of CORE out of that. And when they decided to go to the South, Mr. McCain was the first one hired. And his focus was initially the vote. But when the Greensboro and the Friendship Junior College students started protesting, he was pulled in to teach nonviolent direct action. And Dr. Gaither told me some interesting things about this. He had met Glenn Smiley, who was a CORE member too. And he at first was a little not impressed with nonviolent direct action, right?
That's
and then
correct.
and then he began reading Gandhi, and that changed your viewpoint for the rest of your life, right?
Let me
Gandhi was
sharpen that question, because I want to get to that, because you have many different options of organizations that you could have involved yourself with that were on the South Carolina scene, but you chose CORE. So why CORE and why nonviolence?
okay. I started out with the NAACP, but I was not content to be a litigant in a case where somebody finally got it to the Supreme Court and they said, okay, well, you can go sit at the lunch counters. I've always thought that active involvement in social change produces a person, produces a character that is more persisting in the passion and the call for getting rid of racism and abhorring violence.
And
You've stuck to nonviolence throughout your life, right? This is your philosophy of
yes,
life.
my philosophy is nonviolence, yes.
This is why Dr. Gaither is so important to South Carolina and to the book. He is, this will embarrass him because I've said it before and I know it embarrasses him, but he is a noble and creative person, and he affected deeply the civil rights movement in the United States. He was involved with the Freedom Rides, of course, with Friendship 9. And so his commitment to nonviolent direct action is no small thing. And he expanded how it was used very quickly, from being a senior graduating from Claflin to being a field secretary to being an innovator.
I didn't do that alone. I count as my major mentor, James T. McCain. McCain was a major influence in making nonviolent direct action practical for students who were interested in it just as a technique, not as a philosophy of life. So if you go across all of the sit-ins, and except the ones in Nashville where it was Jim Lawson, you got to see Jim McCain, unassuming, always there. If you needed an answer, if you needed, how do I go about this? He was there to show us the practical way that nonviolence could be used to promote social change.
I had another protester tell me that they would be surrounding Mr. McCain and they would be all excited about all these ideas they had and sort of shouting and having dangerous ideas. And that Mr. McCain would listen and he would nod. And then he would say, and what other ideas do you have? He wouldn't say, that's a bad idea. He would just say, what other ideas might you have? So I think I met him several times. He was a very kind man, wasn't he, Dr. Gaither?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was almost like a second son to him. When I worked in Sumter, I actually stayed close to the street that he lived on, and he had an old 53 Chevrolet, I think, and he would give me the keys to the car. Here, boy, take the keys. Just don't get in any trouble. And of course, I was freedom fighting. I was not looking for any trouble.
That'd be good trouble, right?
That's
both of you
right.
are mentioning some of the people.
Although Mr. McCain helped Dr. Gaither to his first arrest, right? Dr. Gaither
Yes.
rode to Miami with him to an institute.
Oh, that was in Miami, would have been the second one, I think.
Your
My
second.
first arrest was in Orangeburg.
That's right, at the mass march.
Yes, for marching around the courthouse. I was told that we could march around, but we had to keep moving. And out of the line, they had been looking for me apparently all day that the mass march had been going on. they pulled me out of the line and then they took me to the local police station. So that was my first arrest. The next arrest was in Miami, and it was a part of the Corps' Miami Action Institute. And so there I was just playing a word game with a friend from New York, and we were arrested. And curiously, the charge was ejection of undesirable guests. And the judge who heard the case says, I will not adjudicate this. But if you get in trouble again or get arrested again, I will call you back to this court and I will punish you. So my next arrest was, of course, the Rock Hill one.
Going back to Dr. Gaither's first arrest, which was March 15th, 1960 in Orangeburg, he was one of the architects of this mass protest. Several hundred students planned to reach the square of Orangeburg and pray at the statue of the Confederate soldier in front of the courthouse. They planned to sing along the way. They were greeted by fire hoses and tear gas. And the weather was freezing. Columbia had just had the coldest day in its history. And yet these students were soaked, and then they were pinned up outside what was called the Pink Palace, the jail. They were left outside for 4 hours. And the pictures of these students pinned up like this went all around the world with headlines about South Carolina locked students up in a pen like animals. This was the point that national and international media were making. And Dr. Gaither had designed this with your fingers crossed that you'd get bailed out of jail, right? You didn't ask permission of anybody.
No, we didn't have permission from anybody.
Yeah.
But we did feel that the adults would not leave us stranded. So we just went ahead and did the way we thought it should be done. And they did back us, of course.
Can you explain for our listeners?
Wasn't happy about that, Dr. Belk. They felt the Corps was causing a lot of problems and costing them a lot of money.
Well, I want to pull back for a moment. Can you explain to our listeners and our viewers how you prepare for something like that? Because throughout the book, it's noted the harsh reprisals that were visited upon people in the moment, and then the punishments that were also issued out after the moment, when people would use the official power of the state as well as violence to punish those who were involved in the movement. So how do you prepare yourself mentally, spiritually, physically to engage in these demonstrations in 1960, 1961 and beyond?
You have to have a very deep belief in yourself and the methodology and the techniques that you've chosen to make the point that segregation is immoral. And you have to really believe that to the point of being willing to give your life for it, which I think was true in many instances when we wanted to pull students beyond the idea of tactfully using nonviolence, but to the idea of think about this as a way of solving problems. You're going to go sit by somebody, you're going to be well-dressed, you're going to use very good manners. The chance is that you'll be able to touch them in a way that they would not even think they could be touched, and say, well, this is a pretty nice person here. Maybe they do have the same rights and privileges that I have. Maybe my posture and behavior toward them should be thus instead of returning violence for violence. It's not consistent with Christian theology to return an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Gandhi just took it to a little bit more of a practical extreme, and that's what embellished our thought and our mental process as we prepared to face, heaven knows it could be our life.
Chuck McGrew, who was a partner with Dr. Gaither in planning many of these sit-ins, he became the second chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He said that the students often talked about how you had to put your body on the line. It couldn't just be talk. You had to put your body on the line.
I want
A lot of courage.
I want to ask about Rock Hill for a moment. You mentioned Hinton, you've mentioned McCain, and when we come to Rock Hill, Reverend Cecil Ivory is an important figure.
Amen.
And so
Amen.
I'd like for you to tell us about Reverend Ivory and what made him such an important person in the student movement in Rock Hill, particularly when it came to recruiting students from Emmett Scott and from Clinton and from Friendship to be involved in the struggles in 60 and 61.
I remember Reverend Ivory often talking about the beast from the wild will be led by a child. He actually took a lot of his inspiration from the students who had an enormous amount of respect for him. And so he was one of those magical guys. I can't say enough good things about Reverend Ivory. He was not a person who was impressed by organizations. He was impressed by the morality of a society that was just. And he would give anything he could to help to hasten the occurrence of that just society.
He was someone who could talk to anybody, including the white power structure. He was not shy about going to city council meetings, frequently asked for a biracial organization. He had ended the abuse of the Star bus lines. This was the white owned bus line in Rock Hill. After an incident with Adeline Austin White, where she was forced to leave the bus rather than keep a seat that she had been offered. And that campaign that he created started off with drivers, just like in Montgomery, but he ended up with buses that were donated by churches because he could just convince anyone to do what was needed. And the bus line was so successful that the white bus line went out of business, and Reverend Ivory's bus line survived past his death. He died young. He was wheelchair bound, and he died from infections created by the constant sitting he did, which he did because of his activism. But he made a powerful impact in the years that he had. And it wasn't just, it was charm, of course. It was also a powerful physical presence. It was a certain bluntness that I think Reverend Hinton had too. He would get calls from people threatening to bomb his house, and he would say, well, just so you know, I have a rifle and my legs may not work, but my arms and hands do. Come on.
There's a passage in the book where you interviewed his wife, Mrs. Emily Ivory, and she noted that he got a pistol and he would carry it around every night and put the pistol on the night table. Some whites would give him calls and they would say, we're coming, and he would always say, let them come. Mrs. Ivory added, he felt it was not the work of God that we should be humiliated, that we should be segregated, that there was a certain amount God could do, but we had to do the rest for ourselves. And in doing the rest for ourselves, students played a critical role. Why do you think, and I want to put some questions here from the chat together with this question, why do you think Black veterans of the wars, like Black former enlisted folk, played such an important role in bringing leadership and working with students? And why do you think the students were so willing to put themselves out there when so many others were not?
Okay, should I go first, Dr. Gaither?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay, so when soldiers came back from World War II, they were denied, for example, in Somerton, access to the GI Bill, which had been promised to them. They couldn't walk into the front door of many places. They couldn't get a seat in restaurants. And yet they had just come back from defending the country. They had just been fighting for democracy, and then they came home and they were not experiencing democracy. They had discipline. They had expectations. They've been treated like victors and saviors. And they had seen a better life in a foreign country, strangely enough, even if that's during a war. And they came home with high expectations and, as I said, discipline. So, for example, two of the key leaders in the first sit-ins in Colombia were veterans. And so this was often true many places. And fighting to get your GI Bill rights in the 40s was training for what was to come afterwards. But I think one of the things that's happening here, and you need to correct me if you think I'm wrong here, Dr. Gaither, is Dr. Gaither talked about deference and his discomfort with that. So many of the young people knew that their fathers had been to World War II, but they could also see their fathers lower their eyes or take off their hat or accept being refused a service. And this was deeply disturbing to them. And they saw the NAACP, as Dr. Gaither mentioned, going one case at a time. Now, this was very effective. There were desegregation of higher education during Dr. Gaither's time. There was the end of the all-white primary. South Carolina was the last state to have an all-white primary, but it took years and years and years. Briggs versus Elliott, which became Brown versus Board of Education, started with the fathers of some World War II veterans, the Pearsons, and it began in 1946 with a request for a bus. It wasn't until 54 and 55 that Briggs plus other lawsuits became Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended legal segregation in public schools. South Carolina did not begin its desegregation adequately until threatened with withdrawal of HEW funds in 1970. So there's a long, long view that you have to take. And I think the youth wanted to move things on a little more directly. Would you say that was true, Dr. Gaither?
I would definitely underscore that, yes.
And of course, what's so fascinating about what Dr. Gaither and others decided is it's nonviolent direct action. It says what it is, but it is confrontational. You are sitting down next to someone who does not want you to sit down next to them, perhaps. And you are taking a stool and someone may come up behind you to knock you off, to pour hot coffee on you, to do just truly vile things. And it is confrontational, but you do not respond with violence. And so there's one of the phrases that you used when I interviewed you one time, Dr. Gaither, was that you were on a high moral plane.
Yes.
And I love that. The students took a high moral plane and were exemplars, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Including this man right here. You know, he was being an example to other students and to other adults way beyond his years as to how you could shake the system, unsettle the system, challenge the system, and yet do it in a peaceful way that includes confrontation. I just think
we need those kinds of examples today. We need to revisit how we might go about solving problems without the use of violence. Because if violence ever becomes the apparent solution to a problem, it has to be very short-lived, because we'll always remember the person who did something wrong to our relative or to a friend or to someone that we know. And that gets in mind, it stays for an entire generation. So we need to replace that with a healthy respect for each other and with a moral temper that causes us to look for alternative ways to address questions of conflict.
What was it like taking that message to students at the HBCUs across the state in early 1960 as you're trying to bring that sit-in movement to South Carolina? And how did you select the places that you targeted with these various campaigns with students from these different HBCUs?
Well, I think that there was in the environment at that time a desire to do something active that would certainly move us from the kinds of segregation practices that had been previously in existence. So I think all I had to do really as I went from one place to another was to say, here's a strategy for implementing that dissatisfaction you have. And that was not particularly difficult. You had to keep reminding them, but we cannot resort to violence. But I remember one thing, I was working in Sumter, South Carolina with a person by the name of Frank Robinson. Claudia probably knows, heard of Frank Robinson. And Frank Robinson said, I've been trying to get people to register and vote, but I found this 70-year-old lady who would like to do a sit-in. And I said, my goodness, this would be fantastic to get a 70-year-old lady who will go and do a sit-in, obviously shooting holes in what the South had contended, that Black people were happy and they were satisfied with the status quo. So he said, I'll give you her address and we'll go over and talk to her. And I talked to her for about 5 minutes and she says, yes, but I have to be able to take my gun. And I says, no, that is not the way we do it.
One of the things to keep in mind, going back to when we started talking, South Carolina was a small state, and Dr. Gaither could get into Mr. McCain's Chevy, for example, and be somewhere else, teaching people in a very short time. And because it was a small state and there were a few HBCUs, students knew each other through the colleges and university. They knew each other through church. And they could spread the word. There were telephones, there were aunts and uncles, and then people like Dr. Gaither were going to places like Columbia. He went to Columbia to train and to Sumter to train. And then one of the reasons Rock Hill stayed so important was when you came to Rock Hill to train, you had the support of Dr. Ivory having proven that the Black community was totally, well, not totally, but very strongly behind this, both in financial support and emotional support. And you had Dr. Goodlock, right? The president of Friendship Junior College.
Goodlock, yes.
Who would tell the students, you're gonna have the hard times so somebody else can have the good times. So some of the presidents were silent about this, some were intimidated. For example, Governor Hollings sent SLED to Allen and Benedict to say, shut it down. And some, like the Friendship Junior College president, were encouraging the students to be active.
Yes.
And Dr. Gaither, you told me that one of the reasons that you came to Friendship was that you, and to Rock Hill, was that you knew that they had already trained themselves somewhat, right? That they had discipline. They were showing up every day to picket.
Yeah, they had a long history of student involvement in protest activities under the tutelage of Reverend Ivory. And there was a relatively visible professional class that we could depend on in case we happened to get too many people in jail at a particular time. This, of course, was before the jail no bail philosophy actually evolved as a tremendous part of the struggle of the 60s.
Well, hopping to this date, so January 31st was when the Friendship 9 and Dr. Gaither were arrested. And February 1st was when they almost didn't get to go to jail. And so Ernest Finney was the attorney. He was the attorney for CORE in South Carolina. He later became the first Black justice and first Black Chief Justice of the state of South Carolina. And he was quizzing the arresting officer who said just what the students had experienced, that they had barely had their bottoms on the stool before they were arrested. And he said, I gave them 3 to 5 seconds. And Ernest Finney was like, whoa, because it was not, they were being charged with trespassing. It wasn't trespassing to walk into the store. It was trespassing to sit. So he pursued that. He pulled Robert McCullough up, who said, yeah, we could barely sit. We barely sat down before we were being yanked up and marched out. And so then there was a recess and there was a discussion. And then everybody came back and the testimony by the arresting officer changed to 3 to 5 minutes. And John Gaines was very funny about this when I interviewed him. He was one of the other Friendship 9. He said, segregation came through for us. Ernest Finney almost kept us out of jail, but segregation came through.
Yeah, we could not have gotten away from that lunch counter if we had wanted to. I mean, they were so hyper. And we had, of course, talked to SLED, South Carolina Law Enforcement Head, J.P. Strom, on our way to the lunch counters. We had picketed first and then gone and sat down. So we thought that with that discrepancy, we were going to, it was so illogical. That's why they had to call a recess to say, well, hey, this doesn't look very good at all. But we realized also in the back of our minds that we were guilty of trespassing the moment we raised the doors of the store, that the conclusion was already there, and we were already prepared for that conclusion, which was that we would be found guilty and we were sentenced to the 30 days on the road gang.
And then the court was shocked greatly when the students said, no, we're not posting bail. And they accepted a 30-day sentence at York County Prison Camp.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is where the high moral plane comes in, right, Dr. Gaither?
That's right.
Well-dressed, well-behaved young men and 5 women picketing outside, the city girls of Rock Hill, have done nothing except be citizens of America. And they are going to be sent to a prison camp on hard labor. The young women were arrested, but not charged. And so the 10 young men are going to have to go serve a hard labor term at a prison camp because they wanted to sit down and request food.
The very clear point that I would make here is that we could buy at any of the counters in that store. Our money was gladly accepted. But the moment we sat at a lunch counter, which is often a symbol of universal equality, if you are equal to someone, come over for a meal. The moment we sat down at the lunch counter, we were in violation of the local custom and the local law, which of course, but the lunch counter, the customer was always white.
So you look at the Rock Hill demonstration, it's yourself, Robert McCullough, John Gaines, Clarence Graham, William Dub Massey, Willie McLeod, James Wells, David Williamson, and Mac Workman. How did the action in 1961 change or influence the trajectory of the sit-in movement, which after a year, going back to 1960, seemed to be running out of steam when you're the ones who are paying the fines, or your organizations or members of the community? How was 1961 a game changer with the Friendship 9 demonstration?
Well, the jail no bail philosophy, which had been talked about and adhered to briefly before, became the sort of modus operandi for protest in the entire movement, which was tremendous because it was less expensive. But what is perhaps often overlooked is the impact that serving this time and being a part of this kind of protest had on each individual. It was not only a cleansing of a society of an evil, but it was also the producing of people with very stern character and people who were very much focused on what it is they could do during their lifetime to make things better. I think every one of the Friendship 9 lived a life that was different from the life that they would have lived if they had not been a part of the Friendship 9.
This is one of the reasons that I wanted to write stories of struggle, that I was meeting people like Dr. Gaither, and I was feeling that it was an outrage that we didn't know these stories of these incredibly brave people. And that these stories were not just important for us to know in terms of courage and perseverance, but in terms of what Dr. Gaither is mentioning here, that ordinary people could become extraordinary in their own lives and make extraordinary things happen through their goodwill.
Yes.
And these young people, think about being 18 or 19 years old. You're not fully emotionally mature, and you have summoned within yourself enough character that you can accept the abuse and not hate and get up the next day and go do it again, because you know the goal is important and that you are striving to be worthy for those goals, and you keep doing it. So part of it is not just courage in a movement, it's perseverance.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, we had some good examples of perseverance with people like Hinton and Ivory and many of the people you mentioned in your book. I mean, I even learned a lot about perseverance and how you can sometimes be involved in a tremendous social movement. And the involvement is, you don't patronize a store that segregates, which means that you can be contributing to the whole of the group without any kind of personal penalty for it. Not that there aren't those that are numerous examples of giving their all to make sure that the movement was supported. But what about a simple thing? Segregation is an evil. If you buy it at a lunch counter and support it wherever it is, you're supporting that evil. Just don't go and patronize that place. And at least you might cause the person who is the perpetrator to say, hey, maybe I got to change my mind about the way I'm operating my business.
I want to follow up on the treatment that you received as students who were jailed. And this is a question for both of you because you can come at it from different angles. How were you received as college students thrown into a prison farm with the general population as young men? And then for Ms. Smith Brinson, you mentioned that the city girls in Rock Hill were not arrested, but there were young Black women who were in other demonstrations that were arrested and thrown in jail. And how were they treated by people who were with them in the general population?
I'll go ahead and go first. So young men were encouraging young women in these colleges to have a background kind of role. So for example, at SC State, the young women were passing out the flyers and passing the word. They were marching, but there was a danger, a greater danger. This is, the 50s and 60s, and women are not usually out there in the front. And so to be out there in the front is risky because you're Black, because it's activism, and also because you're a woman. And it was an immense sacrifice to decide to go to jail. It means that you have a record when you go job hunting. But more than that, go back to lynching. People all knew people who had died in jail or been horribly maimed. And women were at greater risk in terms of sexual assault. And young men were at risk for being afraid of what would happen to young women and maybe violating their oaths of nonviolence to try to protect somebody. So there was a great deal of tension around women participating, but they did. For example, in Sumter, Dr. Gaither may remember Frances Singleton and May Frances Moultrie. They were assaulted by the police when they were picketing. And Frances Singleton wanted to stay in jail. She was part of CORE, and what happened was one of her professors, she was at Morris College, came the night that she had committed to staying in jail for several days and said that the KKK was hunting her mother and she needed to get out and go home now and get her mother and get to safety. So there were incredible tensions on making these decisions and the risks that would be involved for young men and young women, but it was perceived differently for the women.
It was out of our profound respect for our women that we did not invite them to do some of the things that we would very readily do. It was nothing about deciding that women can't do it. It's just that the dangers were just so ominous. We did not want to tempt them. You ask about how we were treated in the general prison population. We were treated very well. I think the prisoners, for the most part, looked up to us. We worked side by side. They did their work, we did ours. It could have been a much more tense situation, but for the most part, we got along very well with the prisoners.
And they liked your singing, right?
Pardon?
They liked your singing. Why don't you tell them about
Yeah, they did
about-
like our singing. Even though our singing irritated the wardens at the prison, the prisoners liked our singing, and sometimes and occasionally they would join us.
Yeah, you were holding services, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they were holding services, and this camaraderie really irritated one of the guards. And so there was two times that the Friendship Nine were put into solitary confinement, but one of them was over the singing. And so what did they do to entertain themselves in solitary confinement? You sang, right?
Yes, yes. We sang and we talked about food, which I never really quite understood because all we got for food was cornbread a couple of times a day. And we had a cup that was a steel cup that we could drink out of. Wasn't the nicest place to be.
All 9 of them were put into one small room with one tin cup, and there was one window, but it had a steel plate over it. So you were in the dark, right?
A sink and a commode. That was it.
One sink, one commode, and not enough space for you all to lie down at the same time.
That's
You had to
right.
take turns, right, to sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can recall Willie McLeod, who passed away recently, and Dub Massey telling stories about their time in confinement. And it said that there was one man who was in prison, and he said, you know, everyone knows who these young men are, and we know why they're here. And if anyone does anything to them, then you have a problem with me. And so I can recall people talking about the sort of honor that existed, and there were people who knew who you were and were willing to protect you because they respected what you were trying to do.
Yes.
And in thinking about what you were trying to do, and we're getting to a point soon where our radio audience will have to depart, but I wanted to ask this question while our radio listening audience was with us. Is 2021 the future that you and others envisioned when you were doing these things and taking these lumps and making these sacrifices during the freedom movement?
I must say that I'm disappointed at where we are. We have obviously made some significant strides, but we're still breaching and asking some of the same questions. We have to get to the point of asking about questions where we involve honest conversations about race, and we involve a real honest conversation. And we're not there yet, but it's ultimately where we have to get. Removing the legal constraints is one thing, but being able to treat my neighbor as I treat myself is quite another. You can make it illegal for me to do this or that, but then we need to get to that point of respecting each other and moving beyond exercising what is legally correct, right.
I should add here that I think I learned something about movements, writing the book, of course, and talking to all these brave people. And I think it's incredibly wrong to say, oh, things haven't changed in some way.
Yeah.
The school that Dr. Gaither went to is not the school that children would go to now. And we may not, South Carolina is still not educating people adequately, all people, but it's certainly, children are not in the situations that they were in Briggs versus Elliott. So it is unconstitutional to not fully educate children. And we're still making mistakes there, but it's not what it was before. So each of these movements, laws changed and our behavior changed with those laws. So there were brave people who were encouraging our behavior to change. And then there were courts that, under the pressure of incredibly obvious things, had to accept that the Constitution said one thing and we were doing another, and become the true law of the land. And so things changed again. And yes, sometimes it's like 10 steps forward and 8 back, but there is a change, and that happens not just because of brave people like Dr. Gaither, but as I said before, because of their perseverance and because the movement keeps changing. And so I agree with Dr. Gaither on what's happening right now may not be expressed in the best way, but movements do change over time. It's very important that the students did the lunch counter sit-in and in a sense challenged their elders because it was a slightly different time and it needed to move along further, and there needed to be different tactics and strategies to move it along. And so I ended the book, when I finished the book, I know readers can be very upset about all the horrible things they've learned about South Carolina, but I also have hope. I have hope that the examples of these people will encourage other people. And I have hope that people may read stories of struggle and read about someone like Dr. Gaither and say, there's something I can do. And that was a very important part of the movement that Dr. Gaither was in, was everybody could have a role. You didn't have to be the person that sat on the lunch counter seat. You could be the person that did the signs because you didn't know if you could stay nonviolent or you were frightened. So you do the signs or you send out the flyers and you're still an important part of the movement. So the movement has a role for everyone of goodwill. And Terry Plum is reminding me to tell people where to get the book. So you can get Stories of Struggle from the University of South Carolina Press, which has a 40% discount right now.
Wow.
You can get it from Amazon and Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores throughout the nation. You can buy it there and support an independent bookstore. So it's available a lot of places. And Dr. Gaither has his own special copy.
Yes.
Yes.
Just like to interject that there is a generational change in what we are seeing and what we're looking at now. And when students ask me, well, the sit-ins took care of the lunch counters, I say, look around you. There must be something right at your fingertips or in your environment that you can have a passion for that will speak to the questions that are unresolved as far as race is concerned or as far as poverty is concerned. So there's plenty out there to do. And I don't think it's my role to suggest what you should do. It's every individual's responsibility to find out what it is that they can do and get about the business of correcting that in their lives and those around them.
Well, one of the things that people fought for so long ago was a more just and equitable distribution of resources, particularly in the area of public education. And we know that in South Carolina, there was a lawsuit many years ago where students along the I-95 corridor, the so-called corridor of shame, were organizing to advocate for better education, better institutions, safer institutions, more modern materials, all of those things. And ultimately, the outcome fizzled where the state Supreme Court essentially said that the legislature can't be made to do some things to address the disparate outcomes in that area and in similar areas in the state. So when we think about a place where people can do some work, that's certainly one of them. And another, and I want to get into this in our Q&A portion, which I think is going to take place on maybe a little bit beyond our listening audience. If I think about the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, they set off demonstrations across all 50 states. And some of those demonstrations even spread to other nations around the world. Those protests were different than what we observed 60 years ago because they were more likely to be multiracial and multi-ethnic, but we're still watching for people fight for some of the things that you were fighting for then. So there's certainly an opportunity for those who are of goodwill and who feel so motivated to get involved in some way. What I'd like to do now is to pause to give our folks at WRHI an opportunity to get off air. Thank you for joining us this evening. And after our pause to allow them to sort of transition, we can then pick up the conversation and take some questions from our viewing audience. So thank you. And we're back. So I would like to give both of you an opportunity to speak to where we left off with our radio audience, because we look out and we see all these demonstrations. There were demonstrations in all 50 states over the summer, and some of those protests have continued into the fall and now the winter. What does it feel like to see people sort of pushing on the same issues and causes that you were organizing about not that long ago, but long enough ago to think that they might be resolved by now?
Well, I'd say it's refreshing that they picked up the ball from where we moved it. And the multiracial composition of these groups that are protesting is indeed encouraging. It's rather different than my looking back when I was in Orangeburg and all of the participants were fellow students at historically Black colleges. So now that we have at least moved in the direction of saying that this is a national mission, this is something we must do as a nation or as a world, that's encouraging.
I would also add here that I agree with activists, for example, in Black Lives Matter, and some of the scholars that are writing now, for example, Cast or Isabel Wilkerson or Ibram Kendi's books about racism, that the nation was founded with white supremacy and has never quite let it go. And what we're seeing now with whatever you want to call it at the Capitol, the invasion, the sacking of the Capitol, those were white supremacists, and they have been empowered in the last few years to not hide the fact that they're white supremacists. And these groups are founded on this, and it is part of our nation's soil and blood, and it must be purged. And perhaps that's too strong a verb. Maybe I would back up and say, let's just acknowledge it. And it makes people very uncomfortable to think about this shining example of democracy that we see ourselves as, having this terrible past that is also our present and could be our future if we don't deal with it. And as Dr. Gaither says, dealing with it through violence is not effective, and it's not lasting. There has to be other means.
Acknowledgement is at least a starting point, because if we don't acknowledge that there's a problem and we get together, that there isn't anything to talk about, or there isn't any front to move on. One of my other concerns is that we must find an effective way of presenting where we have come from as a nation and where we are as a nation to this generation of students, because in many cases their heart's in the right place, but they have no idea about how we got to where we are now. And I think it's sort of important to read Claudia's book or to do some of the kinds of things that put us in a position of having the ability to critically think about the myriad manifestations of racism in our country.
Thank you for that. And speaking of the book, one of the questions that came into the group chat is that the book doesn't have very many chapters. And that seems to have been a deliberate choice. So can you tell us something about the organization of the text and why you laid things out the way that you did?
Okay, I've worked on this book for a very, 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 very long time. As Dr. Gaither knows, I've been part of the
I kept wondering when is Claudia's book coming out?
Yes, yeah. So I'm interviewing and collecting these stories, and then finally deciding it's a book while I have a full-time job at a newspaper, and I'm teaching part-time at either USC or Columbia College and raising 2 children. So I knew I was going to finish this book. I felt that I was on a spiritual quest and had a deep obligation to the people I interviewed. But as it became a book that was about people. It's not, and this might offend historians, but in general, history books are focused on events, oftentimes great white men making war or something like that. And I'm not that kind of writer, and I am a storyteller, but I'm also a storyteller who could get out of the way of other people's stories. So I was in service to stories. And Dr. Edgar, who's a well-known historian, quizzed me about this. Why is this book shaped like this? He said, it's kind of literary, which I took as a compliment. So I looked at the people I was finding, and I looked at the moments in time and what they were doing in those moments in time. And it seemed to me that I could collect stories around Reverend Hinton, who was the president of the NAACP State Conference from 1941 to 1958, and Briggs versus Elliott, because he was one of the people that sparked that. And then I could collect stories around 1960, and originally the book also had 1961, but USC Press thought that was too long. So goodbye 1961 for now. So I could collect this next movement, which was the young people saying the NAACP didn't do enough, and you elders, didn't do enough. We have more to do. And then the 1969 Charleston Hospital strike is the last section. And it is considered by many the last big civil rights event of the nation. And it also is 400 women who were saying, we want to be treated with dignity. That was far more important to them than the living wage that they were not getting and were also asking for. And it was also an example of, from 40 to 69, we still have white supremacist governors who are bringing in troops with guns. The 400 women are out there picketing and marching with their children in their white nurse's aide and licensed practical nurse uniforms, and surrounding them are National Guards and highway troopers with rifles, with bayonets. I talked to people with bayonets held to their throats. They weren't being violent. And so you can see the South Carolina is constantly over this time responding in very suppressive, antagonistic ways to appropriate requests. And so the people are the stories, and within the people and what they did are these three different examples of movements, but this consistency by South Carolina and its unfortunate responses. And so, yeah, that's me thinking like a certain kind of writer. I also write short stories. I did a lot of big, long pieces for the newspaper where I had to think about structure a lot. And I like the idea that that the form follows the content. And so thinking about the people shaped the book's form for me. Again, service to people and stories.
Two questions related quickly. One, and this might be answered by our good friends at the York County Library. Dr. Gladys Robinson asked, can this program, well, this program is being recorded, will it be shared in other places? Like, where can people find this if they want to share it with others who didn't have the opportunity to join us this evening? Someone will look into it, so they'll work on that. Question for both of you, and then I want to get through some of the other questions in the chat.
Dr. Belk, I can dive in here because I've had
Go ahead.
experience with this. Oftentimes libraries will post, and I think Lindsay's saying that they will post on their Facebook pages, and then you can watch the whole video as a video on the Facebook page. So
I'm also
the York
being
County
told,
Library.
so that's one place where you can find it. I'm also being told that you'll be able to catch it on WRHI's site. So there are a couple of places where it'll be available to folks, and I'll certainly make it available through my social media channels. Question for both of you, Dr. Gaither, what was the hardest part of living through the things that were being addressed in the book? And then for our author, what was the hardest thing to write about, or the hardest thing to sit with as you were working on this project?
I picked up the book without feeling that there would be much emotional attachment. But when Claudia describes the situation in Clarendon County, I think it was, when kids were sitting on the back of a pickup truck going to school, there's something that just touched my heart when I read that part, because I remember living and growing up in Great Falls, which was right on the Chester County Fairfield line. And if we wanted to ride the bus, once we got a bus to ride, we had to get up at 6:30 in the morning. So often we chose to stay in longer and then to walk to the school, which was about 1.5 miles away. And we had to cross over Rocky Creek, and there was a bridge. And we would look up the hill and down the hill to make sure no cars or trucks were coming. But the speed limit on the highway was 55 miles an hour. And so on occasion, we'd get trapped on the bridge with a vehicle going 55 miles an hour, not more than a yard or so away from us. And I think, what a terrible thing to ever do to a child, to force them to do this to get an education, which should be freely available by the government for each and every one. So that was hard for me to stomach, I suppose is a way of saying it.
The children in Somerton went to Scott's Branch in Somerton and lived in Davis Station. Were walking 9 miles. And this is the country. There are dogs attacking them. There are white kids accosting them. And yet they're going to school. They're going in the rain. They don't have the money for a special raincoat or rainboats. They're going to school and they're going to sit wet. And if that doesn't wrench your heart, you're hard-hearted. I began my journalism career as an education reporter, and I never stopped writing about education. I think education opens all doors. And I was befuddled when I first came to South Carolina about this cavalier attitude about thank God for Mississippi. People seem to think it was okay to be 48 or 49 in important measures because, hey, Mississippi was 50. And at some point along the way, I thought, this is also racist. And what was going on here was that white people who were saying this were not doing the math. They were thinking about the deep poverty they could see driving around in the country. And they associated that with Black people. They weren't thinking about the fact that numerically, more white people were poor. And numerically, why was anyone at 48 or 49? Because there wasn't adequate education. So you're not being prepared for well-paid jobs. And your state is never going to rise if well-paid jobs are not coming into the state. So it was a ridiculous cut off your nose to spite your face kind of attitude that still exists. You mentioned Abbeville v. South Carolina. That was a lawsuit in which the schools were saying, we're not adequately educating our children and we need additional support. And the Supreme Court is saying, well, we can't make the legislature do it. And what I saw from every bit of research I did was the legislature was refusing to do the most logical thing. South Carolina over and over again, you could talk about Briggs versus Elliott. You could talk about the Charleston hospital strike. You could talk about Abbeville spending, you could talk about Shannon Faulkner trying to get into the Citadel, spending millions and millions of dollars, taxpayer money, to fight the inevitable. You can see I get on my high horse about this because it's not only morally wrong, it's also stupid. And I found that over and over again. Being someone who's paying attention to education, I felt like education rescued me. I came from a difficult family, and my reading and the fact that teachers paid attention to me because I wanted to succeed in school made a difference in my life. And I mentor children trying to make that same difference in their lives. When it comes to how my heart was touched, everybody I talked to touched my heart. I could almost burst into tears about how much I care about the people I interview, which is not ordinarily how a reporter behaves. But I had a lot of experience in writing heartbreaking stories. For example, I spent a summer with women who were incest victims. I was invited into a group to listen to their stories and then write about them without using their names. So there were many situations I was in as a reporter where people were telling very sad stories and how they were overcoming these difficulties and were entrusting me with them. So I had experience, but I often was what I would call jarred. Chuck McDew jarred me with his stories about his multiple arrests And in 1961, he was a participant in the arrest at the State House that became the lawsuit that the Supreme Court used to decide that all the sit-in participants had been unjustly accused. Anyway, going back to Chuck McDew, he was sent to with many of the other students who were arrested, to the penitentiary because the Columbia jail was full. He had a toothache. He told a jailer. They came and held him down and pulled a couple of his teeth out of the back of his jaw.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, I'm not. And so there are lots of stories, some in the book, some not. And sometimes the people who were telling me these stories were sobbing. And I would bring Kleenex, and I would say, you know, am I correct with you? And sometimes I did, because these are heart-wrenching stories. And it's another reason that we don't know these stories. They're too difficult to tell sometimes. And so people sometimes couldn't tell these stories to their children or their grandchildren, and did tell them to me. So it was a great gift. And I understand why they were kept inside for so long, because it's trauma. It's trauma.
Certainly. One of our audience members asked or wrote, as you all have mentioned, movements look and act differently at different times. How can the principles of the 1960s nonviolent efforts apply today to the way protests and expressing anger are carried out now, especially since it is often used as finger pointing, because you're acting this way, you don't deserve what you're asking for, by those who don't want to listen or make changes?
You want to start, Dr. Gaither?
No, you go ahead. I'm still digesting the question.
Okay, I think Americans are rather strange about anger. That we think anger is good. It's almost never good. The idea of righteous anger is this emotion that surges up in you and leads you to do irrational things. And then you say later, oh, that wasn't really me. So anger is a disturbing emotion for the person experiencing it and the person who is inflicted with harm because of the angry person. So I think Americans probably need to reconsider this elevation of anger. And one of the things I learned from reading Gandhi and talking to Dr. Gaither about the use of Gandhian principles is that Gandhi felt it was individual, right, Dr. Gaither?
Yes.
Yes, that you, the individual, had to reach this point of nonviolent direct action, of satyagraha, or truth
force.
And then you were doing it one person by one person. It was an individual decision with another individual that you interacted with. And you had to be that truth. You had to be that yourself. So it's asking more than linking arms and walking. It's asking a great deal more. It's asking for personal transformation. But as Dr. Gaither said, it makes you a much better person than you would have been otherwise.
One of the other things that sort of runs through my mind as we speak here is that we have to get around to recognizing objective reality. We look at the posture of the South, who said that, oh, Black people like what we're treating them. You know, that's not recognition of a reality. All you have to do is to go down one street and you see that that's not the real world. Until we can be objective about what it is that we are seeing, we will have a difficulty having a conversation because we don't know what we're talking about. To some, the conversation is based on some scheme of something that is not connected to reality. And we see so many examples of that in our contemporary society. We must be able to look at something and see it as for what it is, not necessarily that it has to be one political party or another political party. It is what it is, and we need to agree on it before we can talk about it.
We certainly see the scientists. We certainly see the scientists coming through right now, where there is an objective reality out there, independent of our knowledge of it.
That's
And whether we accept those facts or not, they are facts independent of our attitude about them. So very important there. Someone asks, how can we incorporate ending conflict peacefully in our day-to-day life? What steps can someone take in order to maintain a lack of bias?
Wow. Well, I think getting rid of bias is something that we all work on if we are honest from one point in our life to another to another. Some have gotten it to a degree where it is a controller of our emotions and our attitudes, but some of us have to keep working on it. The problem is those who refuse to recognize that it's there, because again, there isn't anything to talk about.
I grew up as a military brat, and so I lived 16 places in 23 years, and several of those years were not on mainland United States. 4 of them were in Japan, for example. And so if you're always, in a sense, an outsider, you learn to be, an informal anthropologist and to watch and pay attention and see how this is different from that. And so I quickly decided as a child that different was interesting. I think a lot of Americans are brought up to think different is dangerous or bad. We've got to all be in a group where we look like and talk like each other, and that's a mistake. And we all are biased. We have all sorts of biases. And so even as what I call a baby reporter, when I was first beginning, I would take in, and I'm sorry to say this, I'm a mother too, but I would take in my mother's voice, which was rather harsh and judging and bigoted. And I would let her complain about what I saw, and I would think about what those biases were that she was exhibiting that I didn't believe in. And so I would go from there. So an example of that is I was writing about slumlords, and I was in a home with a woman who was raising her grandchildren, was deeply poor, and was missing some windows and doors. And I walked into a bedroom where there were beds and no sheets and pillows and an occasional quilt. So what would my mother say? My mother would say things about housekeeping, but I could say, she's 70 years old, she's got several kids, she doesn't have money to buy a washer and dryer, she doesn't have the strength to be taking big loads of laundry on a bus to a laundromat. She's doing the best she can here. And so there goes a knee-jerk judgment, right? So that wasn't necessarily my bias. That was the bias I was bringing in. But just to pay attention to these random thoughts we have that are absolutely not true. One of the things that I just saw over and over and over again that I've seen recently is the idea of outsiders and invaders. So the students, when they would go in, they were called outsiders and invaders. They lived in the community. They were from South Carolina. And who were these outsiders and invaders? Well, they were Northern agitators and communists. And we saw the same sort of rhetoric with the events throughout the 50 states. Some outsider was coming in. And Dr. Gaither has already pointed this out, that this was a way to deflect from reality and pretend that the Black people of a community couldn't possibly be unhappy with the restrictions that were placed on them. They were just delighted with them and they weren't going to protest. It had to be an outsider that would come in and tell them to protest. Now, that's just on the face. Stupid, right? I think you agree with me, Dr. Gaither.
Yeah, I do. Yes.
I don't think Black South Carolinians needed someone from New York or Chicago
Amen.
to come down south to tell them that they should want to be free. I think that's something that people recognize for themselves and still recognize. You, in your responses, and the question really kind of led us to this, you talked about political socialization, the ways in which we learn about society and politics and see ourselves as actors in those places. Well, that's not something that's done or finished by the time we reach young adulthood. It is an ongoing process. If something can be learned, it can be unlearned. 2 of our participants are asking, well, are there spaces or can we create spaces to have open, frank dialogues between people of different races and ethnicities to sort of kind of build the beloved community that MLK envisioned and where we can kind of understand more about one another and deal with some of these challenges that have really dogged us for many years now. So where might we be able to create these spaces for interracial, multi-ethnic conversation?
Many churches have, white and Black churches have racial reconciliation groups. So you could check with your church. Uh, and the University of South Carolina has a sort of what they call a dinner table conversation. Of course, it's virtual, but there's also a book club associated with that, which many libraries have right now, racial conversations around some of the books that have been recently published. So almost any community you live in, no matter how small, probably has an institution like the library or a church that is trying its best with people of goodwill to deal with this. The Quakers have been excellent at this for forever. They didn't own slaves, for example, and have been very active in peace and conversations about peace. Unitarian Universalists have also done this. They had, and the Baha'i both have been congregations that were not segregated. And so the Methodists are all about social justice. See, we can, there are many religions that are trying to deal with this and also to acknowledge their own biases in the past and their own mistakes. And then there's, one of the wonderful things about Zoom is you can be doing what we're doing right now. You could set up your own group. You could find some like-minded people and pick a couple of books or some topics, and you don't have to travel. You can have your dinner together and have a conversation. I would just urge people not to always be, I'm only going to talk about this with my white friends, or I'm only going to talk about this with my Black friends, to make an effort to have a conversation that is multiracial, and to beware of having that knee-jerk hurt feeling, when it comes up, to acknowledge it, but not let it make you run away.
It's not an easy question to deal with because I think it takes a bit of heartfelt honesty from both sides. And sometimes that gets covered by superficiality and we don't wind up getting anywhere. We spin our wheels. So the most effective groups of this sort that I've seen really took quite a while for the people to develop because I think there's a level of maturity and recognition of reality there that is not automatic because we said we're going to be honest about what we say.
I will add in closing that one thing that we can do is look to some of the sponsors for today's program to get information about these types of events, and they sponsor some of these things on their own. So, we have the York County Library, we have the Rock Hill Community Relations Council, the Freedom Walkway Committee, which puts on an excellent program every year inducting people into the Walkway Hall of Fame, historic Rock Hill, and then look to our local media, WRHI, CN2, as venues that disseminate and share information about events that are of interest to people in the Rock Hill community. I would also make a plug for my institution, Winthrop University. We hold cultural events that are open to the public. And even though we're not gathering in large numbers right now in person because of the continued threat of the coronavirus, many of these events are being done virtually online. So if you follow Winthrop University on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you follow some of these sponsoring organizations on those social media platforms, you can get the information about the programming you're interested in, participate in those conversations, and really do your part to make this a better community and to make a better world. Ultimately, if Black and Brown people were able to eliminate these problems on their own, we would have done so a very long time ago, because people are certainly sick and tired of being sick and tired and living through these things across generations. So we need more people to be involved, and we certainly need white folk to be involved if we are going to make Dr. King's vision of a beloved community that deals with the evils of poverty, racism, and militarism a real place. And we can live up to the idea of having a more just and equitable society, and to make those things real for all. So I understand that many of you could have been someplace else this evening, but you chose to spend your evening with us, and we are grateful. Many thanks to Claudia Smith Brinson for writing a phenomenal book. It's really interesting. You can get it from the University of South Carolina Press with a discount. And many thanks to Dr. Tom Gaither, speaking as an organizer, as a member of the Friendship Nine. Some of those men have gone on to be home with the Lord, and their presence is missed. So I think it's really important to give people their flowers while they're here and they can smell them. So thank you, Dr. Gaither, for your work, and thank all of you for joining us. God bless and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you,
care.
Dr. Gaither.
Thank you, Claudia, for writing a very excellent book.
Goodbye.